When the Duchess in Exile, that perpetual Girl Scout of reinvention, stepped once more into the podcast arena in the spring of 2025 with Confessions of a Female Founder, she did so with the serene confidence of a woman who had already convinced herself that her title, her Montecito address, and her unshakable belief in her own potential were all the credentials any audience could possibly require. Yet as the weeks unfolded, it became painfully clear that this latest chapter was simply the newest verse in an old, familiar song of shortcuts masquerading as destiny. I'm glad you've joined me as we begin to unpick the layers of this development, for beneath the glossy trailers and the carefully curated Instagram announcements lies a tale of ambition colliding with reality in ways that reveal far more about the woman herself than she would ever wish the world to see. One can almost hear the private monologue that must have echoed through the sunlit rooms of the Montecito estate in those early days of recording. "I believe in myself. I believe in our potential for success," she would repeat like a mantra, pacing before the microphone while a small team of producers nodded politely, all the while sensing the gathering storm of skepticism that had already doomed her first podcast attempt. For Archetypes, launched with such fanfare on Spotify back in 2022 under that lucrative multi-million-dollar deal, had promised to dissect and subvert the very labels that tried to confine women, yet after 12 episodes it simply faded away, never renewed, its downloads respectable but nowhere near the cultural phenomenon she had envisioned, leaving behind a quiet sense of deflation that insiders close to the palace circles, even from afar, described as the first real crack in the carefully constructed narrative of effortless triumph. The atmosphere in the household during those final Spotify months had grown thick with unspoken pressure. Prince Harry, according to longtime family acquaintances, would hover at the edges of the sessions offering gentle encouragement, yet one could sense his growing unease at the mounting costs and the visible disappointment when the numbers failed to match the hype, while Meghan herself reportedly retreated into private moments of wounded fury at any comparison to genuine masters of the format like Joe Rogan or Andrew Huberman, men who had spent years honing their craft rather than arriving with borrowed prestige and expecting the world to genuflect. The long-term consequences of that first podcast misfire were already ripening by the time she signed with Lemonada Media. Archewell Audio began to be whispered about in Hollywood boardrooms as a vanity project rather than a serious production house. Future collaborators grew wary, and the financial runway that once seemed endless started to feel uncomfortably short, all of which only intensified the domestic atmosphere where staff turnover whispered of quiet quarrels over creative control and the ever-present need to justify the Sussex lifestyle to their inner circle. Before we begin to separate the quiet truths from the very loud fictions, I advise you to subscribe and turn on notifications. It serves as your direct line to the reality behind the royal facade. Yet undeterred, or perhaps precisely because of that earlier setback, she launched Confessions of a Female Founder on April the 8th of 2025 with Lemonada, framing it as intimate conversations with female entrepreneurs about the real struggles of building something lasting, conveniently timed to coincide with the soft unveiling of her lifestyle brand, as ever. The initial charts looked promising enough, briefly topping business categories on Apple Podcasts, but the 8-episode run that wrapped by early June told a different story once the reviews and listener feedback poured in. A source within the inner circle confided that many high-profile guests had politely declined or limited their participation, leaving the episodes heavy with Meghan's own voice dominating the airtime in ways that felt less like generous facilitation and more like subtle self-promotion. Her questions circling back repeatedly to her own entrepreneurial journey in a manner that struck many as self-indulgent rather than illuminating. One imagines the private turmoil beneath the polished exterior, that defiant inner voice insisting she was offering something fresh and authentic while the external pressure mounted, Harry reportedly growing more visibly strained at the dinner table as the production bills arrived and the Netflix overlords began asking pointed questions about deliverables. The Montecito compound, once buzzing with launch excitement, settled into an atmosphere of tentative damage control, with well-meaning staff members noting hushed conversations about pivoting quickly to the brand before the podcast's shortcomings could tarnish it further. By the time the series entered what was delicately called a strategic pause to focus on other projects, the long-term damage was already done. Credibility in the audio space, so painstakingly built by true experts through decades of consistency, had once again eluded her, leaving Archewell Audio quietly viewed in industry circles as a charming but ultimately unproductive vanity exercise. Future deals now approached with caution, and the financial and emotional weight of repeated reinvention settling like a shadow over the marriage, where the prince's loyalty is said by those close to the couple to be tested daily by the realization that shortcuts, however stylishly packaged, rarely lead to sustainable success. A well-placed production contact has since revealed that the decision to halt new episodes came amid growing internal fatigue and a dawning awareness that without a singular, hard-earned expertise to anchor the content, these podcasts were destined to remain interesting footnotes rather than the empire-building platforms she had promised herself and her family they would become, a quiet reckoning that must have stung for a woman who had once imagined herself reshaping the very nature of women's voices in media. The surrounding atmosphere during those final recording days carried the unmistakable tension of a pivot already in motion, with Harry said to be urging restraint while she wrestled with the internal conflict of whether to admit any misstep or simply move on to the next grand announcement. The external pressure from dwindling loyal staff and the need to project unassailable confidence only adding to the strain that few outsiders truly comprehend. In the end, these audio ventures have etched a lasting pattern into the public memory, not as triumphs of female empowerment, but as cautionary illustrations of what happens when belief in oneself is mistaken for the years of craft, market testing, and genuine mastery that true authority demands, setting the stage for the literary and culinary reinventions that would follow with even greater fanfare and, as we shall see, even more revealing consequences. Yet if the podcast had already begun to expose the fragility of launching into a crowded arena without years of proven mastery, the literary foray that arrived in the summer of 2021 offered perhaps the clearest early portrait of a woman convinced that a single elegant gesture could transform her into an instant authority, as though the title of Duchess alone bestowed upon her the quiet wisdom of generations of storytellers. One can picture the private monologue that must have filled the Montecito mornings in the months leading up to the bench, that soft but insistent voice whispering to itself in front of the mirror, "One book and I'm the new voice for children everywhere, the children's laureate of our time," while drafts were polished and illustrations commissioned with the sort of breathless certainty that brooked no doubt. The launch itself carried all the hallmarks of calculated glamour, celebrity endorsements flowing in, headlines proclaiming a bold new chapter for the former actress turned royal turned author. Yet beneath the surface, the atmosphere in the household was already shifting into something far more subdued. A source within the inner circle recalling how Prince Harry would linger awkwardly in the playroom, attempting to spin the early sales figures into something positive for the sake of domestic harmony, even as the numbers began to tell their own unforgiving story. In the United Kingdom alone, where royal books traditionally find their most loyal audience, the bench managed a mere 8,000 copies across its entire lifetime on the shelves according to industry trackers, a figure so modest it bordered on the embarrassing for a 40-page volume that had commanded a reported £500,000 advance, leaving the children's author identity quietly airbrushed from her own official narrative in the years that followed. The long-term consequences rippled outward with surprising speed. No sequel was ever mentioned again. The dream of building a literary empire evaporated almost overnight, and within Montecito, the quiet disappointment settled like a fine dust over family dinners, where well-meaning staff members noted the subtle tension as the couple confronted the reality that public affection for the Sussexes had not automatically translated into commercial credibility for a children's book. Written, in the eyes of many established authors, by someone who appeared to believe the craft required nothing more than heartfelt intention and a famous name. That early literary stumble, however gently glossed over in public, planted the first visible cracks in the facade and prompted what insiders described as a deliberate pivot toward the world of lifestyle expertise, a realm where the Duchess in exile could once more position herself as the effortless curator of joy and domestic perfection without the tedious apprenticeship others had endured. Whispers of a cooking show began circulating among her small circle as early as 2023, long before the cameras rolled, with frantic recipe development sessions reportedly unfolding in the estate's kitchen, where a source behind closed doors confided that staff watched her Google basic techniques while insisting the final product would feel entirely original and deeply personal. One imagines the inner monologue during those afternoons, a blend of defiant excitement and mounting impatience. Why shouldn't I be the one to redefine lifestyle television, to make everyone feel seen and celebrated through my simple, heartfelt creations? Even as the external pressure of the looming Netflix deal, that much-discussed $100 million rescue package, began to weigh heavily on every decision, the clock ticking louder with each passing quarter. The atmosphere in Montecito grew thick with anticipation mixed with anxiety, Harry said by longtime family acquaintances, to be caught between loyal support and visible unease at the financial exposure, while staff turnover quietly accelerated, well-placed production contacts speaking of hushed quarrels over creative control and the constant need to protect the image of unassailable competence. By tying the cooking ambition so tightly to the Netflix lifeline, the couple had effectively gambled that this latest reinvention would not only recoup the investment, but restore the momentum lost in previous ventures. Yet the long-term consequence was already forming in the background, a slow erosion of trust among the remaining team members who sensed that shortcuts were once again being mistaken for strategy, and that the children's book chapter, now largely erased from the public biography, served as a quiet warning of what happens when credibility is announced rather than earned through years of quiet, unglamorous labor. As those early kitchen experiments gathered pace, the surrounding pressure only intensified, with the Netflix executives watching closely from Los Angeles and the household staff navigating an environment where every new idea carried the unspoken weight of proving the entire Sussex enterprise viable in the eyes of a skeptical world. A well-placed source within the inner circle described the mounting domestic friction. Prince Harry reportedly growing more strained at the dinner table as invoices arrived, and the need to justify the Montecito lifestyle to their shrinking circle of loyalists became impossible to ignore, while Meghan herself retreated into private moments of fierce resolve, convinced that the forthcoming show would finally silence the critics who dared question her expertise in areas she had only recently discovered. Staff departures began to form a noticeable pattern during this period, with publicists and production aides cycling through at a rate that raised eyebrows even among those accustomed to Hollywood volatility, the atmosphere of quiet exodus adding to the sense that something fundamental was not quite aligning despite the outward gloss of launches and announcements. The decision to fold the lifestyle ambitions so completely into the Netflix package, rather than allowing them to develop organically, spoke volumes about the underlying financial urgency, the long-term consequence being that any misstep in the show would not only damage the brand, but threaten the very stability of their post-royal identity, a realization that must have cast a long shadow over the sun-drenched estate, even as plans for the full culinary spectacle moved forward with ever greater determination. And so it was that in the bright spring of March 2025, the full culinary spectacle finally burst upon our screens with the Netflix premiere of With Love, Meghan, presented as the glorious centerpiece that would at last redeem every previous misstep and crown the Sussex enterprise with the effortless glow of domestic authority she had long promised herself and the world. One can only imagine the private monologue that must have swirled through her mind in the weeks before that 4th of March launch, a heady blend of triumphant certainty and quiet desperation. This is it, the pursuit of joy made visible, my vision finally understood. They will see I am the one who brings warmth and beauty to their kitchens without ever needing to prove myself the hard way. Even as the borrowed-looking settings of the Montecito estate were dressed to perfection and celebrity cameos were slotted in with almost frantic precision. The atmosphere on the morning of release crackled with manufactured excitement. Glossy trailers flooding social media, carefully chosen influencers whispering about the transformative power of sprinkling flowers on everything from tarts to lattes to children. Yet beneath the surface, a source within the inner circle has since described a household already braced for scrutiny. Prince Harry reportedly pacing the corridors with the visible strain of a man who understood precisely how much of their remaining financial and reputational capital had been wagered on this single roll of the dice. The surrounding pressure from Netflix executives was palpable. Performance clauses in that $100 million deal looming like storm clouds, while well-placed production contacts spoke of tense editing suite sessions where last-minute cuts were demanded to soften moments that even loyal staff found uncomfortably smug. The out-of-touch styling and the relentless insistence on perfection creating an undercurrent of unease that few dared voice aloud at the time. In those early days, the long-term consequences were not yet fully apparent, but already the seeds had been sown for a reckoning far more brutal than anyone in the Sussex camp had allowed themselves to anticipate. For the public, that intelligent collective we so often underestimate, began to sense immediately that something essential was missing. That this was not the work of a woman who had spent decades mastering her craft, but rather the confident performance of someone who believed confidence alone could stand in for competence. The first season, released to what insiders close to the palace circles later called respectable but unspectacular numbers, managed around 5.3 million views and hovered near 389th place in the global charts, enough to generate polite headlines and a few celebrity endorsements, but nowhere near the cultural phenomenon required to justify the hype or the investment. One pictures the private meltdowns that must have followed those initial figures, the Duchess in exile retreating to her private spaces with the wounded refrain, "They just don't get me. They refuse to see the joy I'm offering." While the atmosphere in Montecito thickened with a mixture of defiant optimism and mounting anxiety, Harry said by longtime family acquaintances to have grown increasingly quiet at dinner, his attempts at reassurance carrying the unmistakable weight of a man watching the pressure build on the woman he had chosen to stand beside. Critics were merciless in their assessment, awarding the series a dismal 23% on Rotten Tomatoes and a meager 3.2 on IMDb, homing in on the grating tone, the borrowed recipes that echoed Martha Stewart's single-skillet spaghetti with almost embarrassing fidelity, and the general air of a lifestyle presentation that felt less like generous sharing and more like a carefully staged advertisement for an as-yet unlaunched brand. A well-placed source behind closed doors revealed that production staff had quietly exchanged glances during filming when basic techniques were rehearsed on camera as though freshly discovered, the cringe moments piling up until the editing team worked overtime to contain them. Yet the final product still carried that unmistakable whiff of entitlement, of a woman convinced that her Duchess title and her polished smile were qualification enough for the role of lifestyle oracle. The long-term damage to the once-vaunted Netflix relationship began to crystallize here. What had been hailed as her savior now quietly viewed in Los Angeles boardrooms as an open secret of mutual disappointment. Future collaborations approached with the caution reserved for projects that promise much and deliver only polite indifference from an audience weary of shortcuts. By the time the second season arrived in late August 2025, the trajectory had become unmistakable, the viewership collapsing to roughly 2 million and the ranking plummeting beyond 1,200th place, a catastrophic drop that even the most loyal defenders struggled to spin into anything resembling success. The holiday special that followed in December fared little better, scraping around 2.4 million views and a 1,022nd position, its festive flourishes lost amid the growing chorus of skepticism that now followed every new drop from the Sussex stable. One can almost feel the electric tension that must have filled the Montecito compound during those autumn months, the inner monologue shifting from defiant joy to something sharper and more defensive. Why do they refuse to embrace this? What more must I give before they acknowledge my vision? While the external pressure of dwindling staff loyalty and the need to justify continued expenditure created an atmosphere of quiet siege, Harry reportedly more visibly strained than ever, his discomfort apparent even in the rare public glimpses that filtered out. Well-meaning production insiders have spoken since of the frantic damage control zooms, the realization that the simultaneous launch of the lifestyle brand had only amplified the scrutiny, turning what might have been a gentle misfire into a spotlight that exposed every borrowed element and every moment of performative perfection. The long-term consequences were now impossible to ignore. Netflix quietly shelved all talk of a third season. The relationship that was meant to anchor their post-royal future reduced to a polite but unmistakable distance, and within the Sussex inner circle, the financial clauses of the original deal began to feel less like opportunity and more like a tightening noose, forcing a desperate acceleration of the brand rollout that had once been intended as the triumphant companion piece rather than the emergency life raft. And so the stage was set for the as-ever empire to step fully into the light, carrying with it the accumulated weight of every earlier disappointment and the urgent, almost frantic need to prove that this time, surely this time, the shortcuts would finally lead somewhere lasting. Yet what unfolded from the moment of its February 2025 rebrand spoke volumes about a pattern now so deeply entrenched that even the most sympathetic observers in Montecito could no longer pretend otherwise. One can picture the private monologue that must have echoed through the sunlit rooms in those early weeks, after she herself quietly admitted the original American Riviera orchard name had become something of a word salad, a phrase that slipped out in one of those carefully managed moments of faux humility. This is cleaner, this is me, this is the vision finally distilled, while limited drops were first sent to a hand-picked circle of celebrities whose polite thank you notes masked the mounting skepticism already circulating in Hollywood. The atmosphere in the household shifted almost overnight into a curious blend of defiant optimism and controlled panic, with well-placed sources within the inner circle describing damage control Zoom calls that stretched late into the night, Prince Harry reportedly sitting in on more than one, with the visible discomfort of a man who understood precisely how much of their remaining financial runway, not to mention the last shreds of public goodwill, had been staked on this single venture. The surrounding pressure was relentless. Netflix executives watching the performance clauses with growing impatience after the cooking show's second season had collapsed to roughly 2 million views and a ranking beyond 1,200th place, while the holiday special scraped by on even thinner numbers, forcing an acceleration of the brand rollout that turned what should have been a measured launch into something bordering on desperation. By November 2025, the first major cracks appeared in spectacular fashion when the signature candle number 84, priced at a confident $64 and marketed as Water Lotus, arrived in influencer unboxing videos without a wick, an omission so basic and so glaring that it went viral within hours, the long-term consequence being that the brand, once whispered about as the potential savior of the Sussex portfolio, became synonymous overnight with ridicule and amateur quality control, a stain that no amount of flower-sprinkled apologies could erase. Even the occasional bright spot, such as a few limited 2026 drops like bookmarks and chocolates that sold out quickly to a loyal remnant of supporters, could not disguise the broader reckoning, for these small victories arrived against a backdrop of refund demands, negative reviews piling up like autumn leaves, and a brand now so thoroughly associated with performative perfection rather than genuine quality that future investors approach with the caution reserved for high-risk vanity projects. One imagines the private turmoil beneath the continued Instagram smiles, that defiant inner monologue insisting the critics are simply jealous or misunderstanding the mission, while the external pressure of dwindling staff loyalty and the need to project unassailable success creates an atmosphere of quiet siege within the Montecito walls. The pattern, when viewed across the entire arc from podcast to podcast, from children's book to cooking show to lifestyle empire, reveals a woman of undoubted charm and relentless ambition who has consistently chosen the glittering launch party over the unglamorous years of mastery, convinced that credibility can be inherited rather than earned through the patient, often tedious labor that true experts have always embraced. Martha Stewart built her name over decades of proven recipes and tested techniques. Victoria Beckham transformed personal discipline into a fashion house that commands respect precisely because it never skipped the hard parts. Yet here we see the same belief that a title and a vision board can substitute for all of that, a conviction that, as the years unfold, has left the Duchess in exile known not for any single enduring achievement, but for the ceaseless cycle of reinvention itself. In the end, the woman who set out to be everything: podcast host, author, chef, entrepreneur, global voice, has, through this relentless pursuit of shortcuts, become known for nothing that truly lasts. A cautionary tale wrapped in the most elegant packaging money can buy, yet still somehow hollow at its core. The monarchy, for all its quiet endurance and deliberate restraint, continues its measured course, while this particular chapter of ceaseless reinvention serves as a vivid reminder of what happens when belief in oneself is mistaken for the hard-won authority the public has always demanded, and in its collective wisdom has always been swift to withhold. Leave your thoughts below. I read every word you write. And if you value this unvarnished look at the monarchy, do ensure you are subscribed and share this with those who appreciate the truth.